Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody and welcome Thea to Tarot Talk Show. I'm so excited to have you here today to pull cards for you and talk about your deck and see where it leads us. Um, I wanted to intro uh, I want you to introduce a little bit about yourself, Thea, but I want to introduce Thea to you. She is an evolutionary astrologer. She is the creator of the American Renaissance Tarot, which we're going to be using today in conjunction with another tarot. And there's a reason for that, and I will explain that. The American Renaissance Tarot is a deck that covers in American history a period of time of about 50 years, 1825 to 1875. I want to ask you a couple of questions before we start pulling cards about it. But it comes with this incredible book, very thoroughly researched. Every card is a story in and of itself, beyond just the correspondence in the tarot. And one of the things that I wanted to ask you, Thea, and you can mention anything else that I didn't mention, but is in the deck there you chose to, in our court cards, you chose to change the page and the knight
Yeah.
from to pioneer and missionary, but kept the queen and the king the same. And I was wondering if you could explain that choice.
I'd be happy to. So first, let me say I'm so happy to be here. I'm honored to be invited, and I'm excited to just get to experience all of you and anyone who's watching after the fact too. I'm happy you're here. So yeah, the other thing I would say that I don't think made it into your intro, so I have a background as an academic. So I spent 10 years researching esoteric traditions in America. And I didn't want to write a boring book about that only a handful of people would read. And so I thought, how do I kind of deliver this really exciting knowledge to young people is what I was thinking, college students, and educate them as they're enjoying a tarot deck. So that's a lot of research that you're getting in this project. So yeah, okay, as far as the pioneer and the missionary, I mean, what I noticed before I undertook this project is there's not a lot of American themed decks. I can't think of very many, but we have like some regional decks like the California deck or the Hoodoo Tarot, and some other ones scattered here and there. But I was trying to just think through those court cards in American terms, because in America, of course, we don't have king and queen, like we abolished that hierarchy. And so essentially what happened is I just could not find great replacement terms for king and queen. I really tried, and I just thought president and first lady is just, that's not inspiring to anyone. So I kept those king and queen archetypes. But the pioneer, the reason I chose that, partly because it's this beginning energy, right? It's the beginning energy of a suit. It's untried. And because I'm using real people, real historical figures in the project, I didn't want to say anyone's a page. It felt kind of insulting, right, for some of these intellectual heavy hitters. So I thought pioneer, it's a new energy, it's untried. And then the knight, I think of as the most extreme energy in the suit. And so I was picking up that American character of the missionary, right? Someone who comes here with a lot of religious zeal. And then, of course, we have the archetype of the pioneer in our history as well. So that's the story there.
I really like that because sometimes, I mean, I know a lot of people struggle with the court cards in tarot,
Yeah.
and sometimes when you encounter a deck and the creator has reconceived that, it helps access that card and the meaning and how you read it or perceive it a little differently when you pull it in a reading. And that missionary designation really opened up nights for me in a different way. It was very helpful.
Oh, that's great feedback. Yeah, no one said that to me before. So that's wonderful.
Yeah. Um, And then the other thing I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about before we start pulling the cards is the the suits. Each of
Mm,
the suits seems to sort of follow a particular literary tradition or historical tradition. And I was
yeah.
wondering if you could talk a little bit about that before we do start pulling the cards.
I can talk about it. The challenge will be to shut me up about it because I can say so much. So there is a little section in this very long intro in this book, right, which explains it. But I tried to break it down by genre. And so the sword suit are essentially an ode to Edgar Allan Poe. But there was a new genre of magazine writing, short story, and that hadn't really been possible previous to this era, right? Because of printing advances. So all of a sudden we have like popular writers. So that's what that suit is owed to, right? That, short form story. And then in Wands, of course, it's mostly dedicated to Moby Dick. And so I just think of wands as the spirit of adventure. And I like to think of sort of like where we're battling God or trying to become God ourselves, right? Marshaling what's best in us. So that epic quest, right? Moby Dick is this huge tome, and this kind of larger than life quest is going on in that novel. And then also some sexuality themes in Melville's oeuvre. I always struggle with that pronunciation of that word. All right, and then Cups, which is the realm of the heart. I kind of split it between two major writers, so Nathaniel Hawthorne and Harriet Beecher Stowe. And Harriet Beecher Stowe, because she wrote this very popular, the most popular novel of the 19th century, was really a melodrama that played on people's emotions to generate empathy for enslaved people. So she's just really jerking at your heartstrings in that novel. And then Hawthorne, if you guys have read his novels or stories, there's not so much plot, but there's like a lot of getting inside the character's head and their psychological motivations and their moods. And so that's how we represented emotions and feelings in the cups. And then lastly, coins, to me, that has to do with real world struggles. So work and money, practical life. And so we use the genre of autobiography there. So in this deck, it's all African American autobiography. And so just kind of showing those struggles in the material world. So there.
And that's, one of the things that I think is so brilliant about your deck and why I think that this is among the most important tarot decks to have been released in the last 10 to 20 years because it's it works on so many different levels.
Mhm.
It's educational, it's historical, it's literary, it's anti-colonial, it's a
Mhm.
commentary on the human condition and our history as Americans, condemning the worst part of it without condemning it all and celebrating the
Mhm.
parts that deserve to be celebrated. Um, and I just find it so rich. If you're interested in history, if you're interested in literature, you have a background in it, um, I highly encourage you to go out and get this deck and read this book. This is just a fascinating read. I mean, I have really enjoyed I haven't finished reading the whole thing, but I really enjoyed the parts of it that I have read, and it's very accessible. So I am going to pull a card now and see where
Okay.
that.
And I'm going to hire you as my publicist because that was just such a glowing review. Thank you.
Well, this is kind of funny because right when you said that, and I think most people know that I am a publicist in my other life, my day job, and I pulled the King of Swords.
Cool. Okay. Yeah. So, um, because I haven't really experienced the format before, do you want me to talk a little bit about King of Swords in general, or just
Well,
like
you
my deck?
can. I want to. So one of the things I want to do because your deck is so unique, and I do want you to talk a little bit about who is on the card and your interpretation of it and how you developed it. But I
Yeah.
also want the card to steer us in our conversation. I think what I would say um, before I turn it over to you is I just found it amusing because swords is the suit of intellect, strategy, communication, how we craft the way that we deliver messages and work with other people on a very real level with words. And it's the work that I do. So as I'm pulling the card and you're going, I'm gonna hire you as my publicist, I just thought it was a funny, it's almost like the deck is having a joke with us, right? Like, oh, hi, I'm gonna
Oh, I love
echo
that.
what
Yeah,
you
no,
said.
that makes perfect sense to me. I mean, it's funny. I thought you were the my guess was that you had the pioneer from that suit because it's a photograph, right? So it's a daguerreotype in
Mm,
the stack. So that one comes up a lot for media presence. But yeah, the King of Swords. So this is Edgar Allan Poe. And I guess I would just say, this was the subject of my dissertation. I'm a huge Poe fan, easily my favorite writer from the 19th century. So I think what people don't know about him, we think of him as kind of like a Halloween haunt character, a creepy, disturbed guy. But he was actually brilliant and innovative, right? So this card in particular is a celebration of the sign Aquarius, which is so inventive. And so Poe invented the detective genre and the code breaking genre, was innovative in sci-fi, right? So prior to Jules Verne, I mean, just a lot of the culture that we have today, I think, comes from Poe. And so we were celebrating his status as an innovator. That's why he has a telescope instead of a sword. So he's kind of looking to the future. And he wrote just this bizarre science fiction poem about life on a star, okay, called Alaraf. So that's actually the poem that we're referring to in the image. So when I pull this card, usually I'm reaching toward genius. That's how I think of the king quality, right? That you're kind of on a mountain by yourself, that no one can approach you, or you're kind of like,
mm.
you don't have any work to do here, right? Like you're on top of the heap in terms of your intellect or your skill with language, as you were saying, and you don't really need anything from anybody. It's like you're in the power position. So that's kind of my read on the Kings.
Right on. And how, so one of the things that I love about this card are those multicolored
Yeah.
orbs floating above him. Can you explain
Yeah.
that for people? And also, I really love the checkered floor,
Mm.
um, which is reminiscent of the High Priestess in a lot of decks. And I was wondering about the significance of that too.
Sure thing. So you may not have noticed, because we weren't able to keep it that consistent, but I did try to color code all of the suits. And so I'm not the artist, I was commissioning somebody else. And so, there's always that back and forth, right? But I was trying to do the swords in black and white, this kind of starkness, right? Because swords have to do with decision making. And so that was the source of the black and white patterning. And then, okay, the stars. I mean, this is such an Easter egg question. This is like, the
We
PhD.
love Easter eggs.
Yeah. So Tycho Brahe, who was I think he's a 16th century Danish astronomer, he discovered a supernova. Okay. And so this was really like it just revolutionized science and kind of helped bring Copernicus's ideas into acceptance, right? That there could be like a new star in the sky after, thousands of years we're looking at the same sky and nothing new appears. So it actually was an old star that exploded. That's a supernova in the constellation Cassiopeia. So those lights in the sky are our imagination of how the stars in Cassiopeia would look from the perspective of this supernova, which is where Poe set this poem. So Alaraf
Mm,
took place on this new star. So like that's Poe's outer space poem. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes total sense. I think that's awesome. I love every time I glean new access into the representation in your deck of these stories, like the ones that I've learned the background of them, and I pull the card immediately, I connect to that. And so it's each time, and when I'm in the shop, when I'm at Tarot Arts and I pull cards and I'm showing this deck to people and I explain to them what I've learned about it and the stories, and Harriet Jacobs, who I didn't know about before you and I started working in that class with the deck together. So uh, there's
Yeah. Sorry to
there's a
step.
lot of no, you can step all over me
Yeah, I
because
mean, I'll
I need
add
to
this
sort
on
of
the
stand
side.
back and
Oh,
let you talk.
um, I'll just kind of finish out with Poe. So, I'm an astrologer, and Poe was a huge astronomy buff. I don't know if people know that. He also has a fair amount of astrological content in his works. And so I gave a talk a couple years ago, which you can find online, which is the esoteric Poe. So a lot of these kind of spooky themes do come from traditions we'd recognize today, which I think is very cool. So, okay. Did you want to go on to the Hanged Man?
Yeah, no, I just so so in a way, I kind of feel like the deck was going, "Shut up and let Thea talk, James. Just hang tight, you know." But I'm curious how you feel right now, and I want to learn with each of these polls. I do want you to explain to people who are watching the story behind the card. But before we do that, I
Yeah.
want to talk about what the card means for a reading in and how it affects us, and what it means as we talk about or as we carry on this conversation. So
Yeah.
pulling the King of Swords and then pulling the Hanged Man, I think, is an interesting progression that is
Mm.
developing. Um, we have I don't think that we can entirely skirt the what is happening in America today,
Sure.
um, post election. For people who may be watching this later on YouTube or whatever, we're less than a week out of the 2024 US election.
Yeah.
And we have a king now elected to our country. And how does this resonate for you then in pulling the Hanged Man
Mm.
right now?
A really big, juicy question. And I just want to say I'm so glad you brought it up. Like, okay, we can talk about what's going on. Because, before I jumped on with James this morning, I was reading for a client who's queer, and their question for me today was, am I going to be alive next year? Right? Like that's the level of fear and grief that's out there, and it's so intense right now. And this card, I do want to talk about the Hangman in general, but it's so potent, I think, for the moment we're in now, and if we can kind of go back to that moment in the 19th century. So like how would I like, approach the Hangman in general in a reading? I tend to just think of it as time out of time, or ritual time, because there's that suspension, of course. And so, I know the conventional view is sort of like, oh, see things from a different perspective, or, a kind of upside down viewpoint. But I associate this card with waiting, like there's some suspension. And so as much as you want to leap into action and make something happen, it's not the time, right? There's some maybe like inner work or contemplative work that we have to do first. And, as far as this moment, I mean, it's funny, the King of Swords came up in my reading that I posted on Instagram the other day, like, okay, what do we do? Like, how do we avoid falling into despair? And that King of Swords to me was saying strategize, right? It's like, okay, we can have all our feelings, but how do we move forward, right? We have to have some kind of plan, or maybe we have to detach a little bit from the emotion so that we can be strategic. And, how I would read this card for this particular time in the lives of many of us. Trump's presidency is not manifest yet. It hasn't happened yet. We have a couple months. And so what we're in now is just like a lot of projections, a lot of fears, a lot of anxiety. But we're still in this kind of suspended animation where we don't know, and so there's that kind of like, you just have to sit with it. None of us likes to hear that, right? But just like you kind of have to sit with the discomfort and see how things unfold. So in some ways, it's kind of reassuring to me, like we don't have to take an action right now.
Right.
I think that's the reassurance of the hangman.
This is a really interesting depiction of the Hanged Man as well. There's a resonance here with the Hanged Man from the Marseille, or with the Emperor from the Marseille, right?
Yeah.
And and as well the Hanged Man. Um, but the the hanging is from the neck and not from the foot, which is typical.
Right.
And it's not the hanging
Right.
doesn't really happen until you invert the card.
Yeah, so I'm a fan of surrealism. So there are some of those artistic elements in the deck. So let me just get into, our inspiration for this card. So, if you're not super familiar with American history, you might not know this, but there was just an abolitionist, anti-slavery zealot named John Brown, and he attempted to lead an armed uprising of enslaved people against the US government. And this happened well in advance of the Civil War. And what John Brown did was really polarize attitudes. It's like some people knew the country was divided, but after he did that, it's just with such different reactions. So in the North, like, oh, wow, he's a hero. He's doing what we all should do, right? He's really
Mm,
standing in his values. And then in the South, the response was like, what a lunatic, attacking the US government. So he was hanged as a criminal. And so this is kind of reaching
mm,
back to that Marseille tradition. And this is a shame painting, right? Like a shame card of an actual criminal, which is the roots of the hangman in Marseille. But what's interesting is John Brown, after he was hanged, he immediately became a martyr and he was invested with all this religious meaning. And so there was a song that the Union soldiers sang about John Brown called John Brown's Body is Moldering in the Grave, right? So they really made him like transpersonal, right? They made him into a myth. And something I think is just wild. I'm not an expert on solar cycles, but here in California, we've noticed that like you've been able to see the northern lights a few times
mm.
this year, right? And that same kind of wild solar activity was also going on in that pre-Civil War period, right? So it just felt like there were a lot of omens or kind of things were ramping up. And so John Brown was associated with all this unusual celestial activity, right? And so there were meteors that were so bright they were visible in daytime. Okay, so that's what we've depicted in the sky. There is a
Mm.
Frederick Edwin Church painting. So he's one of my favorite painters of all time, but definitely my favorite 19th century painter. And he has a painting called Year of Meteors. And so that's what that sky is, right? It's a we just essentially took that painting and put it in the sky to show that he had this sort of uncanny, out of time, there was a sort of like generally spooky feeling about him. Like he was so prescient knowing where the United States was heading. So I know that's a lot right there. But
No, it is a lot, but that's what's so incredible about the work in this deck, and it elevates every time I hear you speak about any of the cards, it elevates the the image and the meaning and the story behind it in a way into myth almost, right? I mean, you talk about how he was mythologized through his martyrdom, but then you mythologize it as well through your tarot. You cement that mythology in a way and elevate it and bring it down to earth at the same time in a way that is digestible and accessible.
Yeah, again, you should be my publicist. So thank you for that. Yeah, there's a really creepy Melville poem that we print in full in the book, just a short poem about that, just uncanny vibe of John Brown. So
Nice. Well, let's see what else is in store for us. Well, I did pull a pioneer,
okay.
and we have the wands.
So fun. Yeah, John Lloyd Stevens. Um, so how do we contextualize him? That's such an interesting card. I mean, do you have a read on how that plays into the current mood? Because I'm not sure. I don't feel like people are feeling very Page of Wands right now, unless it's I want to move to another
Well,
country.
I'm gonna I'm gonna go off
Yeah.
traditional meaning a little bit,
Mhm.
right? And plug into the imagery and what that the image of this card and how it feels and resonates for me just looking at this uh illustration. And
Yeah.
it's almost like the it feels like the Frankenstein mob, right?
Mm,
All of those people with the torches in the night coming for the monster,
mm.
but the monster is us. And I know that that's not the meaning of the
Yeah.
traditional meaning of the Page of Wands or the Pioneer of Wands. But in the context of what we're talking about today and the
Mm,
the very particular place that we are in as Americans in our nation and with the cards that we've been pulling, there is a sense of yeah, we need to take a beat,
mm.
but there's a fire within that needs to that wants to be lit. It doesn't, that fire doesn't want to stay inside. Um it wants to go out and set
Mm.
the world on fire in a way, right? And how do you do that? You do that with that torch.
I like that. Yeah. I mean, what I'm thinking is that yeah, I'm going to make an astrological parallel here, right? Because I tend to think in these big epochs. And so we have Neptune starting a new cycle next year, going into Aries. And as many people are repeating right now, the last time Neptune went into Aries, it corresponded with the first shots fired in the Civil War. Okay, so we're
Mm.
entering into a new epoch, and there's that Aries energy of fire. So I think that even though a lot of us are scared right now of another Trump presidency, I do think it's going to hit different. And I do think that we are going to find more of our personal political agency because of Aries. And so this card, which kind of traditionally Page of Wands is an explorer, right? A traveler. So I think that we are going to have to go into new areas and be brave, right? In that wand spirit, like we have to kind of boldly try something new, whether that is collaborating with our neighbors, our community around a local political issue or cause, and that's scary. I mean, most of us are kind of in our little information silos or, like preaching to the choir sort of thing. The echo chamber is what I'm getting at. So just kind of going out and like, well, how do we do something new? How do we make something different happen? And so, like, one thing I was just trying to do with this deck is make America cool, because I think like so much stuff that happened in the 19th century, like when we look back now, we tend to just dismiss it all. That's what I notice among people on the left, like, oh, everyone was a racist, or, everyone was an evangelical Christian or something. And, it was so rich and interesting and not actually that different from our age in a lot of ways. And so this guy wrote the most popular travel narrative of the 19th century. He wrote one about Egypt that sold really well. But he wrote the first book that exposed Americans to the Mayan ruins. So I don't know if you can see the detail in the card, but there were these beautiful illustrations by Catherwood, I'm not remembering his first name. But it just was like revolutionary. People were so excited that there was this sophisticated ancient civilization in North America, right? It was very exciting for people. And so just kind of that spirit of discovery or going out and discovering something new. And it's it's controversial because, well, Mexican and Central American people knew those sites were there, right? So it's really the first exposure to the West, of these structures and the richness of this culture. And John Lloyd Stevens, to his credit, disagreed with the reigning theory, which is that, oh, maybe ancient Atlanteans, maybe ancient Egyptians, like, some ancient white people came and built this. And he said, no, it's actually the indigenous people, right? This is an indigenous creation, this culture. So, yeah.
So it really is shining the light on
Mm.
and illuminating diversity in this card, going out and asking us to to be aware of other cultures and to be respectful and see into them.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say that's fair. And I mean, it's just so strongly associated to me with indigenous culture and kind of shining a light there. I mean, I think there's just in so many ways, the dominant regime, the government ignores indigenous wisdom. And so I think kind of bringing that back into public discourse, especially in the way that we take care of the land. And so, I mean, I'm thinking of California where we have these crazy fires because we have not followed ancient indigenous wisdom around fire control, right? Controlled burning. So that conversation is kind of happening now, right? Bringing in that ancient wisdom to live in more balance with the land. So,
I love that. It's really important to, it is something that I feel like we've forgotten as a culture is connecting with our ancestors and connecting with the wisdom. And when I say connecting, I mean not just being aware of it, reading about it, knowing that it's there, but feeling it, making an effort to understand it, and then bring it forward and incorporate it
yeah.
because it's not. I feel like I feel like there's a lot of things that have happened in the last 20 years with the advent, and maybe even 30 years with the progress that we've made in with computers and
Mm.
digital technology and the connectedness, which could have been such an amazing thing, but has a much darker side to it, I think, um, personally. Uh, and it tends to obfuscate the past and
Mm.
make what I've seen is, especially with people that were born in the 90s and after that, is this disconnect with anything be that happened before them,
Right.
and which is interesting because at your fingertips is everything that you could possibly need to have. And when I was a kid, I I was interested in the music of the past or the films of the past and the books. I was interested in the contemporary culture as well,
Yeah.
um, but I wanted what I wanted to understand how it evolved into what it is today. And we don't seem to have as much of that. So connecting with that ancestral wisdom and power
Yeah.
could be a particularly strong. Oh, yes. I know this card. Speaking of speaking of communities, we have the Three of Cups.
Okay, so James and I recently got to discuss this card because he sat in on one of my tarot classes, which was so fun. So yeah, Three of Cups. I mean, who doesn't like to see this card? And I will just say, like, for our contemporary situation right now, where most of us in the United States are panicking, we're scared. Please do the Three of Cups. I mean, you have to take care of yourself emotionally, to stay grounded, to have perspective. We absolutely need the lifeline of our friends, of celebration, of fun, just those moments of respite where we can, forget the big picture and just have fun in the moment. And so this card, the Three of Cups, it comes from a pretty lighthearted Nathaniel Hawthorne story in which he's having a lot of fun with gender and sexuality. And so that comes from an interesting theory penned by Frenchman Charles Fourier about ideal living. So he had a kind of utopian theory of how marriage was terrible for women and just really disempowering. So we should just live in these big communes and all share the labor. And hey, if a woman's in love with a woman or a man's in love with a man, people come in those flavors, and that's just fine. And so it's really striking how there's these kind of queer crushes that happen in the novel. So the two women are crushed out on each other, and the two main male characters are crushed out on each other, and almost kind of sort of get married. There's a proposal that happens, and then not surprisingly, Hawthorne ends the novel with a kind of heterosexual resolution, right? Where the most femme character gets together with the most masculine character. And then the commune experiment ends too. Before we get to that kind of, disappointing ending, there's a lot of revelry. There's a kind of pagan revelry in this card. So yeah, I love seeing this one too.
Yeah, I do too. It's and I love that story. I love the story. I haven't I mean, we just ended the class recently, so I haven't had a chance to dig deeper into some of these books because I want to read the Harriet Jacobs book
Mhm.
and I want to read this novel. And I want to read some of the ones that you said aren't so good, but still I think are interesting. Some of the Melville ones.
Right.
Not talking about Moby Dick, although it would be interesting to revisit Moby Dick. Um, so we have time to pull one more card, and then we can open it up for questions.
Okay.
Mm.
My cat would like to participate maybe. So.
This was not the last card I wanted to pull, but we have the Five of Swords.
Oh, you know, sometimes people ask me what my favorite card is in the deck, just as far as the art. And it might be this one. And I think it was the last card that the artist executed because it was such a
Mm,
complicated idea. And she just like didn't really know how to do this like three-way mirror thing. So this is a story, it's one of Poe's early stories called William Wilson, and it's a doppelganger tale. Okay. And so, first we can talk about what the Five of Swords is all about. I mean, I tend to think of the Five of Swords as like someone's not acting ethically, and it could be someone in your midst, right? Someone is not acting ethically and they might plan to betray you. But I kind of like this mirror reflection and what that suggests in this deck, that maybe you're not behaving ethically toward yourself,
mm,
maybe you're not giving your best and highest, or maybe when you look in the mirror, you're really cruel and attacking yourself, right? So I've come to associate this with negative self-talk. That's how it shows up in readings. So when I'm doing readings for folks, um, I tend to think of this one as like, oh, like how are you treating yourself, right? How are you living in your own head? What are you saying to yourself? And in the story, it's really interesting. So William Wilson has this doppelganger, and William Wilson is a criminal. Okay, he's gambling his way across Europe and betraying people, but his doppelganger is always there, speaking in a whisper, telling him to do the right thing. So his doppelganger is actually his personified conscience. And so finally he catches up with his doppelganger and he tries to kill him, but he's only killed himself, right? So that's why we use the mirror. So it's, it's
mm,
like a allegorical story. You can't really say it's realistic or anything. But the reason that we use the three-way mirror is because we had to get five swords in there, right? So because I thought the story worked well for the theme. But so we have the figure holding a sword, and then there's the three reflections of the figure. And then there's that kind of surreal hand behind him. Okay. And this is actually an ode to a Magritte painting. So this is again,
Mm,
fan of surrealists. I can't remember what it's called right now. I'm blanking out, but it's a man looking into a mirror in this Magritte painting, and what he sees is the back of his own head. Okay. So it's something like, reflection or something in the image and in the title rather. But in that Magritte painting, there is actually depicted, which most people don't notice, a Poe novel. Okay. So it's the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is another Poe story about doubles. Okay. So I know it's very Easter eggy here, but can I try to find this Magritte painting real quick? Like just
yeah, sure.
it.
I
Um,
like your while you're looking for that, I'll just comment. I like your reading of that. When I see when if I'm reading with another deck, if I'm reading with like the Waite-Smith deck and the Five of Swords comes up,
mhm.
it's your take on it is interesting to me because I see it as a misunderstanding. Like I'm I'm trying to fix things. Why don't you guys get it? Right? What am I
Yeah.
doing wrong? Um, you're all walking away, but you should be here in the conference, right? And that resonates with what you were talking about in terms of self. Uh, did you say shame?
Mhm.
Yeah.
So the painting is called Not to Be Reproduced.
Mm,
If anyone wants to look for it. But yeah, I mean, I like this hand behind the figure because like what this card reminds me of is like it's so easy to project that everyone else is our problem, right? It's like if we're having those Five of Swords difficulties in life, we're not getting along with people, we can just look out and kind of just point the finger at everyone. But there's that menacing hand behind, right? So it's like, well, what's coming from within? What is that sort of Marsy, aggressive energy that's sort of driving the bus behind you? So yeah.
I'm gonna go a little further with that and be a little more specific. The first thing I want to say is that I don't presume that everybody that's with us now or that may watch on, another platform later, uh, shares our personal political views, right? And I think one of the things that's been really interesting for me in watching this election cycle and reading the analysis of um, why Trump won, why Harris lost, uh, is it all so much of it comes down to you're not listening, right? You're not listening. And so we're gonna I'm not I have very strong opinions um personally, but I do think that even though I disagree with the other side of my, from my personal political beliefs, and I disagree with the other side strongly, I do think that it's a failure when both sides can't hear each other and respect each other and have a conversation. And both sides are guilty of it, right? And in this
Oh.
card, what I think is really interesting is the red and the blue,
Mhm.
the reflections of who we think we are, what we think we are, and those, I mean, you talk about that battle with the self, but it's not just when you have that hand coming in from behind, it's not just the self, or is it? We're all one nation, or are we? There's a lot to think about in this card, I think, both in the red, white, and blue symbolism of what's happening today, the swords, looking in the mirror. I think this is a really powerful
That is
card
a
to
dynamite
land in.
conversation. Yeah, I love what you've said there. And, I noticed that kind of what we're bringing to the conversation, we're bringing a sword. And so then we're meeting other people's swords. We're not having
Mm.
neutral, open conversation. And, I'm with you. I know a lot of people are angry right now and want to like blame and attack the other side. And my position is like, I think most of us are kind of in the same boat. And so we need to learn how to have those difficult conversations so we can reach across the aisle or, reach across the political spectrum to find what we have in common. But I think, yeah, most people who are, feel like they're on the losing side right now, this card describes them pretty well, right? They're looking daggers out at everyone instead of thinking about how we can work together. So yeah, appreciate that
And
take.
that mask, the mask on there is,
Mm.
are we, when you look in that mirror, are you really looking, are you really seeing yourself? Are you really seeing what is being reflected back at you? Whether it's yourself or looking out at the culture around you, are you really seeing a reflection of what exists or a reflection of a fantasy?
Right. So it just kind of reminds me of, there's the stereotype of the liberal and there's the stereotype of the Republican, and most of us are in some messy middle, right? The vast majority of people are not like these cartoon extremes. So I like how you called attention to the mask as just this like simplifying, just kind of reducing to a character. Yeah.
Um, I'm just going to check the chat real quick and see if there's any questions in here. But I would like to open it up for questions and encourage you guys to ask. Just jump in. Feel free to unmute yourself and don't be shy. Is that Liz? Go
Yep,
ahead,
yep.
Liz.
Hi, thanks for this talk. This is great. Um, I'm noticing from what you're showing in the cards and in your discussions, this combination of specificity in the art and in the symbols, and some ambiguous juxtaposition of these visuals in, like you say, with some influence from a surrealist thought about like, how do we put this with this so it's not just like very, very straightforward, very read it one way and you're done. I really admire that, and I would love to hear more about kind of maybe other things that you used for inspiration to help you in pursuing that combination.
Oh, that's a really great question. I mean, I would just say as far as the cards being able to lend themselves to multiple meanings, that was very intentional because I think that's what tarot is. And since I was making a deck about all these 19th century figures, I just had this thought like, well, if we just do straight portraits, every card with a woman in it is going to look the same. It's just going to be this kind of like 19th century lady with a bun, which is not going to give me like, or give the reader the emotional range, right? And the symbolic range. And so uh, I would say it's from all over the map. I mean, there's, some painting references in the deck, and there's also some pop culture references. So, for example, our pioneer of coins as William Wells Brown, and it's after. So he was an escaped slave, and we wanted to show him kind of in the first flush of his success after he escaped slavery, and so we were looking for outfit inspiration. And so I was just thinking of the film 12 Years a Slave, which is not about William Wells Brown, but there's just a fantastic purple suit in that film, so about the free black character walking around. And so, I mean, it's just it's from pop culture stuff that I like, fashion inspiration. The artist really enjoys fashion. And so you might have to ask me with a specific card because it was kind of like, when I was working with Celeste Pilley, the artist, I would send her like 20 JPEGs of, you know, I want this, I want that. And I mean, one was like a 1960s Barbie doll. I was like, I want the outfit to look like this, so it was from all over the place.
I'd be interested in, as since we each have our own demographic and we want to do a tarot deck for with some diversity and with a variety of voices and amplifying other voices. I assume that you, in that process, tried really hard to figure out kind of how to walk that line of making sure you're not just telling one kind of story, but at the same time doing it in a way that's respectful. Just curious about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So again, the deck came out of my background as a literature PhD. And so, for whatever reason, this is just how they do it at most universities. Because you're being trained to work in a specific field, we kind of have to cut everything up into a little box. And so I was trained in American literature, and which meant, I didn't get to read French literature or or whatever, right? It's like we just had to focus on this one thing. So the way that I made choices was to use canonical writers from the mid-19th century. And what that means now is that there are a fair amount of African American voices in the project, but not really any Native American voices, right? Because it was just sort of the earliest days of Native American literature. But that's how I was making choices, like what was published, what was in circulation. And so, I do sometimes wish I maybe was like a little more specific in the title, that it was the abolitionist tarot, because that's really what we're highlighting. I'm not looking at Southern writers. I wasn't too interested in what they were saying. It's definitely like more New England. I wasn't looking at literature that's happening in the West at that time on the frontier. So it was, definitely more narrow toward the transcendentalists and the New England scene.
I want to show a few cards, and we need to wrap it up here pretty soon, but I want to show a few cards to illustrate some of my favorite cards that I learned from you in the class, but also to illustrate some of the diversity in the deck. And you can feel free to speak about some of these. Let me see if I can kind of first of all, this is, I think, one of the most beautiful cards in the deck. It just is gorgeous, and I'm so in love with him. This is our Nine of Cups. And this is Uncle Tom, right?
Mhm. Yeah, I think the artist did an amazing job there, kind of with all the backdrop of how controversial that novel is, right? And then just wanting to create a portrait that was really beautiful and dignified. I think she did just such an amazing job. So yeah, glad you appreciate that one, James.
Yeah, I do really love it. And I loved learning more about that novel, which I never read because I don't know, it wasn't something that was required reading when I was an English major. And the negative connotations of the history of how that novel was um, devoured by and regurgitated by a society that didn't that took advantage of the characters and character made
Caricature.
caricatures out of so many of these characters, when it really was such a beautiful uh, story that was intended to move a nation and did move
Yeah,
the needle of a nation.
it's really edgy content. I felt like that was the edgiest content in the deck. But what people don't often know is that it was an anti-slavery novel. I think we have such a kind of weird memory of it that we think like it was doing something bad. But actually Lincoln approached Stowe and said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the big book that made this big war." And so he was very much crediting her with awakening empathy in the populace. I'm getting chills talking about it. Yeah, so just kind of
And this is another scene from Uncle Tom, right?
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So this image on this card, it was one of the most produced lithographic images in the 19th century. So people would have something like this hanging in their home, and it was a protest, right? To say that, a Black person and a white person can be friends, right? They can have something like a family connection. Of course, they're reading the Bible together because it was the 19th century, so it's very kind of
Very
evangelical
not so different than today.
in a lot of ways. Yeah. Yeah.
Um, just a few more cards I wanted to show, these are all, if I'm remembering correctly, these are all Harriet Jacob cards.
Actually, you know, the last one, where the woman who's crossing the ice, that was a famous vignette from Uncle Tom's Cabin.
Oh, this is from Uncle Tom, right? Okay.
Yeah, but she's also Jacobs is the Queen of Coins as well. And so, just one of my favorite works of literature from that time is, it's called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And that's Harriet Jacobs' story. So she appears on the Sun, the Queen of Coins, the Four of Coins, and the Nine of Coins.
And this is a particularly, this was an interesting choice for the Four of Coins, because it doesn't feel very Four of Coinsy when you know when you know the story, and at the same time,
But it's an image of a storage shed, right? So we have
right.
kind of like stockpiling and saving theme of the Four of Coins. But yeah, a lot more going on. I don't know if it's, you know, it's the end of the class if or the hour. I don't know if I want to get into the story because it's
No, I understand. I
yeah.
leave a little bit for people to go and explore and encourage them to do so as well. But I just wanted to show a few more of those cards. I will ask if there's, you know, if anybody has a last question. Don't want to cut anybody off. If anybody does have a burning question, I think that we should hear from people if you do. But don't be shy. Don't be shy.
I think we stumped the band.
Going once, going twice.
Oh, I'll ask one. So when you do tarot readings for people, do you work with them to ask which deck they would like to use, or do you tend to use your deck, or how do you approach what deck you use?
That is a good question. So, James and I were just talking about how we need to get together and share our tarot collections with each other because I have a huge tarot collection. And so it's mostly a choice of my intuition. And if someone feels very fragile or they're going through something difficult, I pick one of my feel good decks. You know, I have a little pile of the feel good decks, you know, that can be really encouraging. But I have clients all over the spectrum, some who have more occult interests or, you know, just have more, I don't know, like abrasive, resilient personalities. So I can use some of the more edgy decks. So I use my deck maybe 1 out of 6 times, you know, 1 out of 6 or 7 times. And I often use multiple decks when I read too. So if there's multiple questions, right, I'll tend to reach for a new deck. So it just depends. But I'm not married to my deck. I like reading in lots of different voices. So
Thank you.
Cool. Well, thank you everybody for joining us today, and thank you, Thea, for being here and letting us interrogate you and letting me pull cards to
I was
get a
honored.
feeling.
It was a great time, and I think I loved your reads on the cards and how they pertain to our current moment. So that was insightful for me. So thank you.
Well, one of the things I like to do later, once we're off of here too, is just kind of evaluate the spread and look at all the cards together. And I will post those on Instagram later to see the full array of what we pulled and an analysis of that. And you're welcome to please chime in. Any of you, welcome to chime in. So thank you so much for joining today, and we'll see you on the next Tarot Talk Show.
Wonderful. Take care.
Bye-bye.